Dear students, this is the third and last lecture about risk assessment. And the third lecture talks about risk assessment procedure. Like every kind of assessment, also risk assessment has several steps which you need to follow while doing the procedure. First, it is planning, and second, it's a gathering information stage. The most important steps are identifying hazards, estimating risks from those hazards, and proposing safety measures. Afterwards, the person who conducts risk assessment makes a summary, sends the report to the management for decision making, and after that risks are mitigated, and if needed, a follow-up assessment is being done. Planning stage is important because you need to know the time limit of the procedure, but also who is going to conduct risk assessment. Usually risk assessment is conducted by a team. Safety manager is the main person conducting the risk assessment, but it's always very good if he involves the workers, because the workers are the ones who know the best what kind of working conditions they have and what kind of hazards they pose every day. You also need to select a suitable method and supportive procedures. Also, assess the current risk management policies and how is the plan of action reviewed and implemented so far. So the planning stage before the assessment is very important. But even more important is gathering and analyzing information. There is a lot of different information available which is useful for the risk assessment procedure. The most important information is definitely the data about occupational accidents, because these have already happened because of certain hazards. But also the job instructions, safety guides, machinery passports, and maybe also machinery failure data. But you need to remember that written data is only a reflection of a certain fraction of the real situation, which means that sometimes the real situation is different than the situation in paper. So it's important to observe the job procedures and to see whether the job instructions are followed. Do they match the job procedures? And is there a need for interviews, questionnaires, photos, if the written data is so different from the real situation? So once you have gathered the information, you can start the main steps of risk assessment, being identifying hazards, estimating risks, and proposing safety measures. Let's talk about first identifying hazards. It is a crucial part, because if you don't identify anything, how can you assess the risks? While identifying hazards, you usually need to do it systematically and by group, for instance, first taking account all the physical hazards, after that chemical hazards, followed by biological hazards. Maybe you need to do some of the hazards groups more extensive assessment because they are more important or may have more problems. But also you need to look at the psychosocial hazards as well as physiological hazards. Some of the hazards are measurable, so then you should measure them, because this way you can say that you have assessed the hazards more objectively. The other hazards are not measurable, and maybe you need to use questionnaires in order to find them out, or observations. It's also important to estimate the exposure. For example, it's very different if you are exposed to a hazardous chemical, for instance, formaldehyde, for a second or for the whole working day. This also is the same with a noise. If you are in a noisy environment for 8 hours, or if the machine makes noise only for 10 minutes. So exposure assessment also is a part of identifying the hazards. Once you have identified the hazards, you need to start estimating the risks from those hazards. And for that, the easiest way, you can use the risk matrix. We discussed risk matrix in our previous lecture. Risk matrix plots probability and consequences and finds through this risk levels. And as those are numerical results, the risk matrix is called as a semi-quantitative way of assessment. For the measurable hazards, probably occupational exposure limits are set by countries. So to estimate the risk, you also need to follow the regulation and find out whether there are occupational exposure limits for those particular hazards. For instance, noise has an exposure limit of 85 decibels for 8 hours. So if you measure in your company and the value comes, for instance, 88, then there is a problem and the risk is high for the employee to get a hearing impairment. The same goes to chemicals, vibration, electromagnetic fields, and so on. After estimating risks, especially for those hazards which have very high risks, you need to prioritize those hazards and start to find out what kind of safety measures would mitigate those risks. The more ideas you have for the safety measures, the better it is. And safety measures, while doing the assessment of them, need to follow the hierarchy. But first, you also need to ask several questions about the safety measures. Does the extent of the measure match the size of the risk? What effect will the measure have? Does the measure have a short or a long-term effect? Does the measure have only a local workplace effect, or might it only apply to a particular machine, or are its effects more general? Are there positive and negative effects, and what are the financial considerations? But general rule is that the more ideas, the better. While proposing safety measures, you should think about the hierarchy of safety measures. The best way is to eliminate the hazard. Let's say the company needs chemical cleaning, and those chemicals in these cleaning processes are carcinogenic. They cause cancer. Then it's a very good reason to try to eliminate the chemical cleaning, and maybe the company can find another type of cleaning, for instance, ultrasound cleaning, and can start to implement this new method. This way, the hazard is totally eliminated and people are not exposed to carcinogens anymore. But it may not be always possible, because sometimes the procedures are in place, it's too expensive, or the procedure just needs those chemicals. Then you can think whether there is a way to isolate the hazard. Maybe you can have a cabin for the chemical cleaning so that it's been done automatically and the workers do not need to be exposed to this carcinogen. So this is isolation of hazard. If that is not possible either, then you should think of mitigation of the hazards. Even here, the hierarchy should be followed, which means that engineer control methods are the most efficient. Engineer control methods, for instance, involve local exhaust ventilation, which can be quite effective for the chemicals because the fumes are taken away before they enter the human breathing zone. Administrative methods are considered to be less effective, but they are also used. Here, administrative methods need, for instance, adequate training for the workers, adequate safety instructions for the workers, but also decreasing the hours of work being exposed to this chemical. And then personal protective equipment. personal protective equipment is always the last method, because even when they might be quite effective on this moment, then at once the worker removes the personal protective equipment, he is not protected at all anymore. So personal protective equipment never mitigate the hazard itself. Also, this carcinogenic chemical is still in the air. You just put a mask for the worker and he can wear it for a certain amount of time, but it's always more uncomfortable, it's always the work is slower, and so on. So even when personal protective equipment is the cheapest and probably the quickest way to protect people, employers should always think about engineering control methods and administrative methods before. Here you can see also a way to protect the worker from the carcinogenic chemicals. Sometimes it's important to use several different measures in order to be effective. Then the risk assessment is summarized, the main hazards are mentioned, and the report has been sent to the management for the decision making. Sometimes the management would say that the most expensive safety measures cannot be implemented. So the smaller and more cheaper safety measures will be implemented, and then you should do a follow-up risk assessment to find out whether the risks are mitigated as low as possible. So this is shortly the steps in risk assessment. And in the end of this lecture, we will also look at the risk assessment report. We have to keep in mind that risk assessment report should be a practical document. It should show the review of the company, shortly also the methods how you identified the hazards, as well as if you had the measurements of hazards, then the results of hazards, but also the methods for assessing risks, at least the risk matrix, because companies can use different risk matrices in their risk assessment procedures. Usually the hazards themselves and the risks posing from those hazards are presented in the form of table. So in the risk assessment, you usually see a review of hazards, people who are exposed time, possible health impacts, risk levels, and safety measures. Also, risk prioritization is done to show the hazards with the highest risk levels. And usually a separate document is about the plan of action to prevent risks. So please keep in mind that risk assessment is a practical document. So this is the third lecture about risk assessment. Thank you for listening.